My name is Dante Romano. 31 days ago, I was flipping pancakes at a Denver diner when Yellowstone erupted and plunged the world into an ice age. The sun disappeared behind ash clouds, temperatures dropped below freezing, and civilization collapsed within weeks. I went from being a chef to leading 17 desperate survivors in a frozen wasteland where every decision meant the difference between life and death. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. If you're hearing this, it means you made it through the first month too. My name is Dante Romano, and I need to tell you exactly what happened those first 30 days, because what I learned might save your life. I'm recording this from what might be one of the last warm buildings left in America, and every word I'm about to tell you is the truth about how the world ended and how some of us managed to survive. 31 days ago, I was just another chef in Denver, Colorado, flipping pancakes at the Sunrise Diner on Colfax Avenue. It was October 15th, 2024, and I remember thinking it was one of those perfect fall mornings where everything felt right with the world. The aspens were turning that brilliant gold color they get this time of year, and the Rocky Mountains looked so close you could almost reach out and touch them. I had no idea that in less than 4 hours, everything I knew about the world would be gone forever. I'd been running the Sunrise Diner for about 3 years at that point. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, just another greasy spoon in a city full of them, but it was mine. I'd worked in professional kitchens for 16 years, starting as a line cook when I was 18 and working my way up through every position you can imagine. I'd seen the inside of fancy hotel restaurants, high-end steakhouses, even did a stint at a place that served food to celebrities when they came through town. But the diner was different. The diner was home. That morning started like any other. I got there at 5:30 in the morning, same as always, and started prepping for the breakfast rush. Miguel Ramirez, my prep cook, showed up at 6. Miguel had been with me since I opened the place, and he was one of those guys who could make magic happen with a knife and a cutting board. We had this routine down to a science. I'd get the griddle hot and start mixing pancake batter while Miguel prepped vegetables and got the coffee going. By 7, we were ready for whatever the morning threw at us. The news had been talking about some increased activity in Yellowstone National Park for a few weeks. You know how it is with the news, though. They make everything sound like the end of the world. Earthquakes in California, hurricanes on the East Coast, volcanic activity in Wyoming. It all blended together into background noise after a while. I remember Miguel mentioning it once or twice, asking if I thought it was something to worry about. I told him what everyone else was saying back then. The scientists had it under control. These things happen all the time. Yellowstone's been rumbling for years and nothing ever comes of it. I wish I'd been paying more attention. The breakfast crowd was typical for a Tuesday. We had our regulars, of course. Mrs. Patterson, who came in every morning at 7:15 for black coffee and wheat toast. Bob Jenkins, the construction foreman who always ordered the Denver omelet and complained about the hash browns being too crispy, even though he'd been ordering the same thing for 2 years and never asked us to change how we cooked them. Sarah Martinez, the night shift nurse from Presbyterian St. Joseph who stopped by after her shifts for coffee and whatever pastry looked good that day. It's funny how normal everything felt that morning. I was standing at the griddle, flipping pancakes and listening to Miguel tell me about his daughter's soccer game the night before, when the whole world changed in an instant. It was 11:47 in the morning. I remember the exact time, because I just glanced at the clock thinking we were past the breakfast rush and starting to prep for lunch. That's when Miguel burst through the kitchen doors with his face white as flour, pointing at the small television we kept above the coffee station. "Chef Dante," he said, and his voice had this quality I'd never heard before, pure terror. "You need to see this." I walked over to the TV, wiping my hands on my apron, expecting to see another story about traffic accidents or city council meetings. Instead, I saw something that looked like it belonged in a movie about nuclear war. There was this massive mushroom cloud rising from what the news reporter was saying was Yellowstone National Park. The cloud was so big it filled the entire screen, stretching up into the sky like some kind of monster reaching for the heavens. The reporter was talking fast, stumbling over her words, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. She kept using phrases like unprecedented eruption and supervolcanic event and ash column extending 30 miles into the atmosphere. The few customers we had in the diner had stopped eating and were staring at the screen with the same expression Miguel had. Complete disbelief. I stood there watching that footage, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. It wasn't fear, exactly, not yet. It was more like the feeling you get when you realize you've made a terrible mistake in the kitchen, like when you forget to turn off a burner and come back to find smoke filling the room. That moment when you know something's gone very wrong, but you haven't quite processed how wrong yet. The news kept cutting between the eruption footage and maps showing the projected path of the ash cloud. Wyoming, Colorado, Nebraska, Kansas. All of it was going to be covered in volcanic ash within hours. The reporter was interviewing some scientist who was trying to explain what this meant, but you could tell even he didn't really know. He kept using words like uncertain and monitoring the situation and unprecedented in recorded history. That's when Mrs. Patterson, who'd been sitting at her usual counter stool nursing her black coffee, spoke up. "This happened before," she said quietly. "My grandfather used to tell stories about the year without a summer. 1816, I think it was. A volcano erupted somewhere in Indonesia, and the ash blocked out the sun for months. Crops failed, all over the world. People starved. I looked at her, this 70-something woman who'd been coming to my diner every morning for 3 years, and realized I'd never really listened to her before. She was always polite, always paid her bill, always left exactly the same tip. But I'd never thought of her as someone who might know things, who might have wisdom that could matter." "How long did it last?" I asked her. She shook her head slowly. "The stories varied. Some said months, some said over a year. But my grandfather always said the same thing about that time. He said the people who survived were the ones who knew how to work together, the ones who shared what they had and looked out for each other." I didn't know it at the time, but Mrs. Patterson was giving me the first piece of advice that would keep me alive over the next 30 days. My grandfather had told me similar stories when I was growing up. He'd come to America from a small village in Italy, where winters were harsh and food was scarce. He used to say that in the hard times, the man who could feed people became the most important man in the village. I'd always thought those were just old country tales, the kind of stories older people tell to make their past seem more dramatic than it really was. I was about to learn how wrong I could be. By noon, the ash was starting to fall in Denver. At first, it looked like snow, these gray flakes drifting down from a sky that had turned the color of old concrete. Some of the customers thought it was beautiful in a strange way. Bob Jenkins even went outside to catch some on his hand, laughing about how he'd never seen anything like it. But I was watching Miguel, and Miguel was scared, really scared. He'd grown up in Mexico in a small town near a volcano that had erupted when he was a kid. He knew what volcanic ash could do. He knew how it got into everything, how it made it hard to breathe, how it could bury cars and collapse roofs if enough of it accumulated. "Chef," he said to me quietly while the customers were distracted by the TV, "we need to start thinking about supplies. If this keeps up, if it gets worse, the trucks won't be able to make deliveries, the power might go out. People are going to get desperate." I nodded, but I don't think I really understood what he was telling me. I was still thinking, like a restaurant owner. I was worried about losing business, about how long we might have to stay closed, about whether our insurance would cover damage from volcanic ash. I wasn't thinking about survival yet. I wasn't thinking about the fact that everything I knew about the world was about to change. The temperature started dropping that afternoon. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a few degrees here and there. But by evening, it was noticeably colder than it should have been for mid-October in Denver. The ash kept falling, and the sky stayed that sickly gray color even as the sun started to set. I stayed at the diner later than usual that night, partly because I was worried about leaving it empty with all the uncertainty, and partly because I didn't know what else to do. Miguel had gone home to be with his family, and I didn't blame him. If I'd had a family waiting for me, I probably would have done the same thing. Instead, I found myself cleaning the same surfaces over and over, organizing inventory that didn't need organizing, anything to keep my hands busy while my mind tried to make sense of what was happening. I kept thinking about Mrs. Patterson's story about the year without a summer. I kept thinking about my grandfather's tales of harsh winters and communities pulling together to survive. Around 9 o'clock that night, I finally decided to head home. My apartment was only about 10 blocks from the diner, and I usually walked when the weather was decent. But as soon as I stepped outside, I realized this wasn't going to be a normal walk home. The ash was still falling, heavier now, and it crunched under my feet like snow. But it wasn't like snow at all. It was gritty and fine, and it got into everything. My eyes started watering almost immediately, and I could taste it in my mouth even though I was trying to breathe through my nose. The streetlights looked dim and hazy through the falling ash, and the whole city felt muffled and strange. I made it home, but it took me twice as long as usual. The ash was already accumulating on cars and sidewalks, maybe an inch or two deep. When I got to my apartment building, I found my neighbors standing around in the lobby, talking in hushed voices about what was happening. Everyone had theories, but nobody really knew anything for sure. That night, I lay in bed listening to the news on my radio. The reports were getting more serious as the hours passed. The ash cloud was spreading faster than they'd initially predicted. Airports were closing across the Midwest. The interstate highway system was shutting down sections where the ash was too thick for safe driving. But what really got my attention were the reports about temperature drops. Not just in Colorado, but everywhere the ash cloud had spread. Scientists were starting to use terms like volcanic winter and global cooling event. They were talking about how volcanic ash in the atmosphere blocks sunlight, how it can cause temperatures to drop by 10 or 20 degrees or more. I thought about my restaurant, about the old gas stove that had been there when I bought the place. The previous owner, an old Greek guy named Stavros, had insisted that gas was better than electric for cooking. More reliable, he'd said, won't let you down when you need it most. At the time, I'd thought he was just being stubborn, clinging to old-fashioned ways. Now I was starting to think he might have been smarter than I'd given him credit for. I also thought about the basement storage area under the diner. It wasn't huge, but it was well insulated and could hold a lot of food if I organized it right. When I'd first taken over the place, I'd used it mainly for extra supplies and equipment. I didn't need upstairs. But it occurred to me that if things got really bad, if the power went out and the heating systems failed, that basement might be one of the warmest places in the neighborhood. The second day was when reality started to set in for most people. The ash kept falling all night and all morning, and by the time I got to the diner, there was almost 6 inches of it covering everything. The city looked like something out of a disaster movie. Cars were buried, street signs were barely visible, and the few people who were out were wearing masks or covering their faces with scarves. The power was still on, but it was flickering on and off. The news reports were talking about rolling blackouts as the electrical grid struggled to cope with increased demand for heating. More importantly, they were talking about supply chain disruptions. Trucks couldn't get through on the major highways. Airports were closed indefinitely. Food deliveries were being suspended until further notice. That's when I started to understand what Miguel had been trying to tell me the day before. This wasn't just about my restaurant staying closed for a few days. This was about the entire system that kept a city of over 500,000 people fed and warm and safe breaking down all at once. I spent most of that second day doing inventory. Really detailed inventory, the kind I usually only did at the end of each month for tax purposes. I counted every can of vegetables, every bag of flour, every bottle of cooking oil. I calculated how long my current supplies would last if I had to feed not just my usual customers, but people who might be desperate for any kind of hot food. The numbers weren't encouraging. Under normal circumstances, I kept about a week's worth of food in stock. But if the truck stopped coming, if the supply chain really was broken, a week's worth of food wasn't going to help anybody. That afternoon, I made a decision that probably saved my life and the lives of a lot of other people. I closed the diner early and drove to every grocery store, restaurant supply company, and wholesale food distributor I could find that was still open. I maxed out every credit card I had, spent every dollar in my business accounts, buying canned goods, dried rice and beans, cooking oil, Salt, sugar, anything with a long shelf life that could feed a lot of people. Most of the places I went were already running low on supplies. Other people were having the same thoughts I was. But I had an advantage that a lot of them didn't. I knew the food service industry. I knew which suppliers had backstock, which distributors kept emergency reserves, which restaurants might be willing to sell their inventory if the price was right. By the end of that second day, I'd filled the basement storage area under the diner with enough food to feed 20 or 30 people for at least a month. Maybe longer if we were careful about rationing. I told myself I was just being cautious, just preparing for a temporary disruption that would blow over in a week or two. But deep down, I think I already knew this was going to be much worse than that. The third day was when the temperature really started to drop. When I woke up that morning, my apartment was cold enough that I could see my breath. The heating system was running constantly, but it couldn't keep up with the dropping temperatures outside. When I checked the weather report, the overnight low had been 15 degrees colder than normal for October. The ash was still falling, though not as heavily as the first 2 days. But what had already fallen wasn't going anywhere. The streets were becoming impassable. The city was starting to shut down services. Garbage collection was suspended. Public transportation was running on a limited schedule. Even the police and fire departments were operating with reduced capacity. I made it to the diner that morning, but it took me almost an hour to walk those 10 blocks. The ash was deep enough now that it came up to my knees in some places, and it was mixed with real snow that had started falling overnight. October snow. Isn't that unusual in Denver, but this was different. This was heavy, wet snow that stuck to everything and didn't melt. When I got to the diner, I found Miguel already there, along with his wife Carmen and their 8-year-old daughter Sophia. They'd spent the night in the diner because their apartment building had lost heat, and Miguel was worried about Sophia getting sick. "I hope you don't mind, Chef," Miguel said, "but the gas stove was the only source of heat we could find. Everywhere else is either closed or too cold." I told him of course I didn't mind, and I meant it. But seeing them there, seeing how scared they were, made me realize that the diner was about to become something very different from what it had been just 3 days earlier. It wasn't going to be a restaurant anymore. It was going to be a refuge. Over the next few hours, more people started showing up. Mrs. Patterson came in around 9 carrying a small suitcase and asking if she could sit by the warm stove for a while. Her apartment building had lost power overnight, and at her age, the cold was dangerous. Then came Bob Jenkins, who said his house had frozen pipes and no heat. Then Sarah Martinez, who'd just finished her shift at the hospital and couldn't get home because her car was buried under ash and snow. By noon on the third day, I had 7 people in my diner who had nowhere else to go. They weren't customers anymore. They were refugees from a world that was falling apart faster than anyone had expected. That's when I had to make the first real decision of what would become the most important month of my life. I could try to keep running the diner like a business, charging people for food and coffee while they waited for things to get back to normal. Or I could accept that things weren't going to get back to normal, at least not anytime soon, and start thinking about how to keep these people alive. I thought about my grandfather again. He'd always said that in Italy, during the hardest winters, the people in his village would pool their resources. Everyone would contribute what they could, and everyone would share in whatever they had. It wasn't charity exactly. It was survival. I walked over to the group of people huddled around the gas stove and made them an offer. If they were willing to help with cooking, cleaning, and whatever other work needed to be done, they could stay as long as they needed to. We'd share the food I had stored in the basement, and we'd make decisions together about how to ration, add, and make it last. Mrs. Patterson was the first to agree. She said she'd been a nurse before she retired, and she knew how to take care of people. Miguel and his family were already helping, of course. Bob said he was handy with repairs and could help maintain the building. Sarah pointed out that as a hospital nurse, she had medical training that might be valuable. By the end of that third day, we had the beginnings of what I would later think of as our little community. 7 people who'd been strangers or casual, acquaintances just a few days before, now depending on each other for survival in a world that was getting colder and more dangerous by the hour. The 4th day brought new challenges and new people. The power went out around 6 in the morning and didn't come back on. The gas was still flowing, so we still had heat from the stove and could cook food, but everything else was dark and cold. We had to start using candles and flashlights to see, and we had to be much more careful about conserving the food we had. That morning, a family with 2 young children showed up at our door. The Hendersons, Jim and Linda, with 10-year-old twins, named Jake and Emma. Their house had become uninhabitable when a tree, weighted down with ash and snow, had crashed through their roof. They'd spent the previous night in their car with the engine running for heat, but they were running out of gas and the children were getting sick from the cold. Jim Henderson was a mechanic, which made him immediately valuable to our little group. Linda was a teacher, which meant she could help keep the children occupied and calm during what was obviously a terrifying time for them. I agreed to let them stay, but our group was growing faster than I'd anticipated. We now had 11 people, including 3 children, depending on the supplies I'd managed to stockpile. The 5th day was when we had our first real test as a group. 3 men showed up at the diner around midday, demanding food and shelter. They weren't asking politely. They were making demands, suggesting that they had a right to whatever we had simply because they needed it. I recognized the type immediately. I dealt with difficult customers and problem employees throughout my career in restaurants. These were guys who were used to taking what they wanted through intimidation and threats. In normal times, I would have called the police and had them removed. But these weren't normal times, and I had no idea if the police were even still functioning. The leader of the group was a man in his 30s who called himself Rick. He was big, probably 6.5 feet tall and well over 200 pounds. He had tattoos covering his arms and a way of speaking that made it clear he wasn't used to being told no. The other 2 men with him seemed to be following his lead, but they looked nervous and uncertain. Rick walked around the diner like he owned it, looking at our setup, counting the people in our group, obviously calculating what we had that he wanted. When he saw the warmth coming from the gas stove and smelled the soup that Carmen was making. For lunch, his eyes lit up with a kind of predatory hunger. "Nice little setup you got here," he said to me. "Warm, food, plenty of space. Room for a few more, I'd say." I told him we were already at capacity, that we barely had enough supplies for the people we already had. But Rick wasn't interested in explanations or negotiations. "Here's how this is going to work," he said. "My guys and I are staying. We'll help with security, make sure nobody else bothers you. In exchange, we get fed and we get a warm place to sleep. Fair deal, right?" The way he said it made it clear he wasn't really asking. This was him telling me what was going to happen. But I looked around at the people who were depending on me. At Miguel's daughter Sophia, at the Henderson twins, at Mrs. Patterson with her gray hair and fragile bones, and I knew I couldn't let this happen. I told Rick that we'd made agreements about how our group functioned, that everyone contributed work in exchange for food and shelter, and that if he and his friends wanted to stay, they'd need to follow the same rules as everyone else. Rick laughed, and it wasn't a pleasant sound. "Rules?" he said. "Old man, the world ended 4 days ago. There are no rules anymore. There's just who's strong enough to take what they need and who's too weak to stop them." That's when I realized that the skills I'd learned in professional kitchens were going to be more important than I'd ever imagined. Not just cooking skills, but the ability to manage difficult personalities under pressure, the ability to establish authority and maintain order when everything was chaos. I looked Rick in the eye and spoke in the same tone I'd used with unruly line cooks and problem customers for 16 years. Calm, firm, and absolutely certain. "In my kitchen," I said. "My rules. You don't like the rules. There's the door." For a moment, I thought he was going to try to make good on his implied threats. His hands clenched into fists, and the 2 men, with him, moved closer like they were preparing for a fight. But then something shifted in the dynamic. Maybe it was the way Miguel stepped up beside me, or the way Bob Jenkins moved to block the path to where the women and children were sitting. Maybe it was just that Rick realized that while he might be able to take what he wanted through violence, he'd be creating more problems than he'd be solving. Whatever the reason, Rick and his friends left. But not before Rick looked me in the eye and said, "You're making a mistake, old man. When things get really bad, when your food runs out and people start freezing to death, you'll wish you'd been smarter about who you made friends with." After they left, Miguel came up to me and said something that I'll never forget. "Chef," he said, "I think we're going to need to start thinking about protection. Those guys will be back, and next time, they might not be so willing to just walk away." That night, I made a trip to my apartment to collect some personal belongings and anything else that might be useful. But the real reason for the trip was to get something I'd hoped I'd never need. My grandfather's old butcher knife, the one he'd brought with him from Italy when he immigrated to America in 1938. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, forged from high-carbon steel with a handle made from olive wood. My grandfather had used it to break down whole animals when he worked as a butcher in Little Italy, and later to prepare family meals for Sunday dinners that would feed 20 or 30 relatives. When he died, he'd left it to me along with a note that said, "A man who can feed people will never be without friends, but sometimes he needs to be able to protect them too." At the time, I'd thought it was just a sentimental gesture. Now, I was beginning to understand what he'd really been trying to tell me. The 6th day brought the heaviest snowfall yet. Real snow this time, not just ash, falling on top of the volcanic debris that already covered everything. By noon, it was almost impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. The temperature had dropped so far that water left sitting out would freeze solid within an hour. We were completely cut off from the outside world now. No power, no phone service, no way to communicate with anyone beyond the walls of the diner. For all we knew, we were the only people left alive in Denver. For all we knew, the same thing was happening in cities all across the country. That afternoon, Mrs. Patterson asked me a question that I'd been dreading. "Dante," she said, "how long do you think this is going to last?" I looked at her, this elderly woman who'd been coming to my diner every morning for 3 years, who'd become like a grandmother to all of us over the past 6 days, and I realized I didn't have a good answer. "I don't know," I told her. "But I know we're going to take it one day at a time, and we're going to take care of each other." That night, as I was doing my evening inventory count, I faced a reality I'd been trying to avoid. Even with all the food I'd managed to stockpile, even with careful rationing, we had maybe 3 weeks of supplies left, and that was assuming no more people joined our group, which seemed unlikely given how desperate things were getting outside. I went to bed that night thinking about my grandfather's voice, about the stories he'd told me of surviving harsh winters, in a small Italian village where cooperation meant survival and selfishness meant death. "Dante," he used to say, "in the hard times, the man who can feed people becomes the most important man in the village." I had no idea how prophetic those words would become, or how much more important than feeding people I was about to become, to the survival of our little group. Because the 6th day was just the beginning. The real challenges, the real tests of who we were and what we were willing to do to stay alive, were still ahead of us. As I lay there listening to the wind howling outside and the sounds of 11 people trying to stay warm in a building that was never designed to be anyone's home, I realized that everything I'd known about my life before was gone. I wasn't a restaurant owner anymore. I wasn't just a chef. I was becoming something I'd never planned to be, something I'd never wanted to be. I was becoming the person that other people depended on to stay alive. And tomorrow was going to be the first day of finding out whether I was strong enough for that responsibility. The 7th day was when everything changed forever. I woke up before dawn to the sound of silence, and that's when I knew we were in real trouble. The constant hum of electricity that you don't notice until it's gone, the distant sound of traffic, even the rumble of snow plows that had been working around the clock for the past few days. All of it had stopped. I got up and tried the light switch in my small office behind the kitchen. Nothing. I checked the radio we'd been using to get news updates. Dead. Even the emergency broadcast system that had been running continuously since the eruption had gone quiet. The power grid hadn't just failed in our neighborhood. It had failed completely. But when I walked into the main dining area where everyone was sleeping, I heard something that gave me hope. The soft hiss of gas flowing through the lines to our old stove. Stavros, the previous owner who'd insisted on keeping the gas system, when everyone else was switching to electric, had just saved all our lives. We still had heat. We could still cook. We could still survive. Miguel was already awake, sitting by the stove with his daughter Sophia on his lap, both of them wrapped in blankets. When he saw me, he nodded toward the window. "It's bad out there, Chef, really bad." I looked outside and saw what he meant. The snow had kept falling all night, and now it was so deep that it covered the windows on the ground floor almost completely. We weren't just cut off from the outside world anymore. We were buried in it. "How much food do we have left?" Miguel asked quietly. I'd been dreading that question, but I'd also been preparing for it. With 11 people, if we're careful about portions, maybe 2.5 weeks. 3 weeks if we get really strict about rationing. Miguel nodded slowly. He understood what that meant. In 3 weeks, if nothing changed, if no help came, if we couldn't find more supplies, people were going to start dying. That morning, I called our first group meeting. I gathered everyone around the gas stove, the only source of heat and light we had, and laid out our situation honestly. No power, no communication with the outside world, limited food supplies, and no way to know when or if any of this would change. Mrs. Patterson spoke first. "How do we decide who gets how much food?" she asked. It was a practical question, but I could hear the fear behind it. She was the oldest person in our group, and she knew that when resources get scarce, the elderly and weak are usually the first to be sacrificed. "We all get the same amount," I said immediately. "Adults get adult portions, children get child portions, but nobody gets more or less based on age or strength or how useful they are to the group." Bob Jenkins raised his hand. "What about work assignments? If we're going to survive this, everyone needs to contribute." That's when I realized I was going to have to start thinking like more than just a chef. I was going to have to think like a manager, like a leader, like someone responsible for keeping 11 people alive in conditions none of us had ever imagined. I assigned tasks based on people's skills and abilities. Miguel and I would handle all the cooking and food preparation. Carmen would help with meal planning and inventory management. Mrs. Patterson and Sarah would be responsible for medical care and keeping track of everyone's health. Bob would handle maintenance and repairs on the building. Jim Henderson would work with Bob on anything mechanical or structural that needed attention. Linda would organize activities for the children and help maintain morale. But even as I was organizing these assignments, I was thinking about what Miguel had said the night before about protection. Rick and his friends were still out there, somewhere, and they weren't the only desperate people in a city of over 500,000. Eventually, someone was going to come looking for what we had, and I needed to be ready for that. The 8th day brought our first real test of the rationing system. We'd been eating relatively normally for the first week, but now we had to start cutting portions. An adult got 2 meals a day instead of 3, a small bowl of soup or stew for lunch, a slightly larger portion for dinner. The children got 3, smaller meals, but even their portions were less than what they were used to. I watched Jake and Emma Henderson, the 10-year-old twins, trying not to complain about being hungry. I saw the way their parents looked at their own portions and then at their children, clearly wishing they could give them more. That's when I understood one of the hardest parts of leadership in a survival situation. It's not just about making the right decisions. It's about watching the consequences of those decisions play out on the faces of people you've come to care about. Carmen Ramirez came to me privately that afternoon with a confession that made my heart sink. "Chef Dante," she said, "I've been giving Sophia extra food, just a little bit from my own portions, but I thought you should know." I understood completely. Sophia was only 8 years old, and she was scared and hungry and didn't understand why she couldn't have as much food as she wanted. But I also knew that if I let one person break the rationing rules, even for the most understandable reasons, the entire system would collapse. I had to make one of the hardest decisions of my life. I told Carmen that I understood why she'd done it, that any parent would want to do the same thing, but that the rules had to apply to everyone equally. If Sophia needed more food, we'd adjust the rationing system for all the children. But we couldn't have individuals making their own decisions about food distribution. Carmen nodded and apologized, but I could see in her eyes that she wasn't really sorry. She was a mother protecting her child, and she would do it again if she thought she had to. That's when I realized that managing our little community was going to be more complicated than I'd anticipated. People would say they understood the rules, but when it came to protecting their own families, those rules might not seem so important. That evening, I made another trip to my apartment. Officially, I was going to collect more warm clothes and blankets for the group. But really, I was going to get my grandfather's knife and to think about what Miguel had said about protection. The walk to my apartment took almost 2 hours. The snow was now so deep that I had to dig my way through it in some places, and the cold was so intense that I could only stay outside for a few minutes at a time before I had to find shelter and warm up. But I made it there and back, and I brought more than just clothes and blankets. I brought my grandfather's knife wrapped in an old dish towel and hidden in my backpack. I also brought a baseball bat I'd kept in my bedroom closet and a small hatchet I'd used for camping trips. I told myself these were just tools, that I'd probably never need to use them as weapons. But deep down, I knew I was preparing for the possibility that keeping our group alive might require more than just careful food rationing and good organization. The 9th day was when Mrs. Chen arrived. She was our first new member since the Henderson family, and her arrival changed everything about how I thought about our group and our future. Mrs. Chen was in her 70s, a tiny woman who couldn't have weighed more than 90 pounds. She showed up at our door around noon, barely conscious from hypothermia and exhaustion. She'd been walking for 2 days, she told us later, after the senior living facility where she'd been staying had lost heat, and the staff had abandoned the residence. Sarah Martinez immediately went into nurse mode, getting Mrs. Chen warm and checking her for signs of frostbite and other cold-related injuries. Mrs. Patterson helped by making hot soup and finding dry clothes that would fit her. Everyone in the group stepped up to help, and I was proud of how quickly and naturally they responded to someone in need. But Mrs. Chen's arrival also forced me to confront a reality I'd been trying to avoid. Our food supplies were calculated, for 11 people. Now we had 12. Our carefully planned rationing system would have to be adjusted again, and our 3-week supply had just become a 2.5-week supply. More importantly, Mrs. Chen's story about the senior living facility made me realize that we weren't the only group of people trying to survive in the city. There were probably dozens, maybe hundreds of other small communities like ours, all competing for the same limited resources. Some of them would be friendly and cooperative like Mrs. Chen. Others would be more like Rick and his friends. That night I asked Jim Henderson to help me with a project. We went through the diner systematically, identifying weak points where someone could break in, and brainstorming ways to make the building more secure. We moved heavy furniture in front of the main windows. We identified the best locations to position people if we had to defend the building. We made sure everyone knew where the exits were and had a plan for what to do if we had to evacuate quickly. Jim was a practical man, and he understood what we were preparing for. "You think they're coming back?" he asked. "Those guys from a few days ago?" "I think someone's coming back," I told him. "Maybe them, maybe someone else. But when people get desperate enough, when they've been cold and hungry long enough, they stop asking politely for help." The 10th day brought the first real test of our security preparations. It wasn't Rick and his friends, but it was close enough to make everyone in our group understand that the world outside our diner had become a very dangerous place. A group of 5 people arrived around mid-morning, led by a woman named Janet, who claimed to be a nurse from the same hospital where Sarah worked. She knew enough medical terminology and hospital procedures to make her story believable, and Sarah was initially inclined to trust her. But something felt wrong to me from the beginning. Janet and her group were too well fed, too clean, too organized for people who'd been surviving on their own for 10 days in the conditions outside. They had good winter gear, and seemed to know exactly what they were looking for when they asked about our supplies and our setup. Janet made what sounded like a reasonable proposal. Her group had medical supplies and some food. She suggested combining our groups and our resources, sharing everything equally, and working together to survive. On the surface, it sounded like exactly the kind of cooperation my grandfather had talked about. But I'd learned to read people during my years in the restaurant business. I'd learned to spot the customers who were going to skip out on their bills, the employees who were going to steal from the register, the suppliers who were going to try to cheat me on quality or quantity. Janet had all the signs of someone who was running a con. I told her we'd need to discuss her proposal as a group, and I asked her and her people to wait outside while we talked it over. That's when Sarah told me something that confirmed my suspicions. "I've never seen her before," Sarah said. "I've worked at Presbyterian St. Joseph for 6 years, and I know every nurse in the building. She's not one of ours." We decided to tell Janet that we appreciated her offer, but we weren't ready to combine groups at this time. Her reaction told me everything I needed to know about her real intentions. She became angry immediately, demanding to know why we were being so selfish, insisting that we had a moral obligation to share our resources with people who needed them. When I remained firm in our decision, Janet made it clear that this wasn't really a negotiation. "You're going to regret this," she said. "There are a lot of desperate people out there, and word gets around about groups that have food and heat. You can't protect what you have forever." After they left, I realized that our diner had become more than just a refuge. It had become a target. People knew we were here, they knew we had resources, and they were starting to organize efforts to take those resources away from us. That afternoon, I made a decision that would define everything that came after. I gathered the group together and told them we needed to start thinking about ourselves differently. We weren't just a group of people who happened to be sharing space and resources. We were a community, and communities protect themselves. I asked for volunteers to help with security. Bob and Jim immediately stepped forward. Sarah surprised me by volunteering as well, pointing out that her medical training included dealing with trauma and injuries that might result from violence. Even Mrs. Patterson offered to help, saying that her nursing background included military service during Vietnam. Miguel pulled me aside after the meeting and said something that I'll never forget. "Chef, you know I'm with you whatever you decide. But are we really talking about fighting people? About hurting people to protect what we have?" It was a fair question, and it was one I'd been struggling with myself. "I hope it doesn't come to that," I told him. "But if it does, if someone tries to hurt the people in this group, then yes, we're going to defend ourselves." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the knife hidden in my backpack, about the conversation with Miguel, about Janet's threats and Rick's promises to come back. I'd gone from being a chef who worried about food costs and customer satisfaction to someone who was preparing for the possibility of violence, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that transformation. But then I thought about Sofia Ramirez, 8 years old and trusting that the adults around her would keep her safe. I thought about Jake and Emma Henderson, trying to be brave while their world fell apart around them. I thought about Mrs. Chen, who'd walked for 2 days through a frozen wasteland because she had nowhere else to go. These people were depending on me, not just for food and warmth, but for protection, for leadership, for the kind of strength that could keep a small community alive when the rest of the world was falling apart. The 11th day was when I had to put those thoughts into action. Rick came back just like he'd promised he would, but this time he didn't come alone, and he didn't come asking for permission. It was early in the morning, maybe 7 o'clock, when we heard them outside, not knocking on the door, not calling out to ask for help. The sound of someone trying to force their way in through the back entrance to the kitchen. I'd been awake for about an hour, checking on the stove and starting to prepare breakfast. When I heard the noise, my first thought was that an animal had gotten into the dumpster area behind the building. But then I heard voices, low and careful, trying not to be heard. I woke Jim Henderson quietly and motioned for him to get Bob. Within minutes, we had our security plan in action. The women and children moved to the safest part of the building, behind the main counter where they'd be protected by the thick commercial kitchen equipment. The men positioned themselves at the points we'd identified as the most likely entry routes. I took my grandfather's knife out of my backpack and unwrapped it for the first time since I'd brought it to the diner. The blade caught the light from the gas flames, and I could see my reflection in the polished steel. For a moment, I thought about my grandfather using this same knife to cut meat for family dinners, and I wondered what he would think about what I was preparing to use it for. The back door to the kitchen finally gave way, with a splintering crash. Rick came through first, followed by the 2 men who'd been with him before, plus 3 others I didn't recognize. They were all carrying weapons, crowbars, baseball bats, a couple of kitchen knives of their own. Rick, saw me standing by the stove with my knife in my hand, and he smiled. Not a friendly smile, the kind of smile a predator gives when it's cornered its prey. "I told you we'd be back, old man," he said. "And I told you that you'd wish you'd been smarter about making friends." "You're not welcome here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Take your people and leave." Rick laughed. "I don't think you understand the situation. We're not asking for permission anymore. We're taking what we need, and you can either cooperate or get out of the way." That's when Bob Jenkins stepped out from behind the industrial refrigerator with a baseball bat in his hands. Then Jim Henderson appeared from the other side of the kitchen, holding the small hatchet I'd brought from my apartment. Rick's smile faded as he realized this wasn't going to be as easy as he'd expected. "You really want to do this?" Rick asked. "6 of us, 3 of you. Those aren't good odds." "You're right," I said. "They're not good odds. For you." That's when Sarah Martinez stepped into view from the dining room, holding a heavy cast-iron skillet. Mrs. Patterson was right behind her with a rolling pin that looked like it could break bones. Even Miguel appeared, carrying the largest knife from our kitchen set. Rick looked around at all of us, clearly recalculating his chances. But he'd come too far to back down now, and he had 5 other people who were counting on him to get them food and shelter. "Have it your way," he said, and he rushed toward me with his crowbar raised. What happened next was the most intense 30 seconds of my life. I'd spent 16 years in professional kitchens, working with sharp knives under pressure, developing the kind of hand-eye coordination and quick reflexes that come from years of precision cutting. But I'd never used those skills in a fight before. Rick swung his crowbar at my head, and I ducked under it while bringing my grandfather's knife up in a defensive position. The blade caught his forearm, not deep enough to cause serious damage, but enough to make him drop his weapon and stagger backward. Around us, the rest of the fight was happening in a chaos of movement and shouting. Bob was swinging his baseball bat at one of Rick's friends. Jim was using his hatchet to keep 2 others at bay. Sarah had actually connected with her cast-iron skillet and dropped one of the intruders to his knees. But the turning point came when Miguel stepped forward and put his knife to Rick's throat. Miguel was a small man, not physically intimidating under normal circumstances, but he'd grown up in a rough neighborhood in Mexico City, and he understood violence in a way that I was only beginning to learn. "You heard the chef," Miguel said quietly. "You're not welcome here." Rick looked around at his friends, half of whom were on the ground or backing toward the door, and made the smart choice. He raised his hands and told his people to retreat. "This isn't over," he said as they backed out through the broken door. "You can't guard this place forever. Sooner or later you'll make a mistake, and we'll be waiting." After they left, we spent the rest of the morning securing the building and treating the minor injuries from the fight. Nobody had been seriously hurt, but everyone was shaken by what had happened. The children had heard the whole thing from their hiding place behind the counter, and they were scared and confused about why adults were fighting each other. That afternoon, Linda Henderson sat down with Jake and Emma and tried to explain what was happening in terms they could understand. "Some people are scared and hungry," she told them, "and when people get really scared, sometimes they don't make good choices. But there are good people too, people who try to help each other and share what they have." Jake, who was 10 years old and thought he understood more about the world than he actually did, asked the question I'd been dreading. "Are we the good people or the bad people?" Linda looked at me across the room, clearly not sure how to answer that. Because the truth was, we'd just used violence to protect our resources from people who were probably just as scared and desperate as we were. We'd made a choice to prioritize the survival of our group over the needs of others who might have just as much right to live as we did. "We're people who take care of each other," I told Jake, "and sometimes taking care of the people you love means you have to make hard choices." That night, as I was cleaning my grandfather's knife and putting it away, I realized that the fight with Rick had changed something fundamental about our group. We weren't just survivors anymore, we were defenders. We'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and everyone in the group knew it. Mrs. Patterson came over to me as I was finishing up in the kitchen. "You did what you had to do," she said. "But I want you to know that what happened today, that's not who we are. That's not who we want to become. I nodded, but I wasn't sure I agreed with her completely. The world outside had become a place where strength and willingness to fight were the qualities that determined who lived and who died. I could wish it were different, but wishing wasn't going to keep 12 people alive in a frozen city where the rule of law had collapsed. The 12th day was when we discovered that we weren't as alone as we'd thought. Mrs. Chen, who'd been with us for 3 days now, mentioned that before she'd found us, she'd encountered other groups of survivors. Some had been friendly and helpful, sharing information about which parts of the city were still habitable and which areas had become too dangerous to enter. Others had been hostile, viewing any stranger as a potential threat or competitor for resources. This information changed my perspective on our situation completely. I'd been thinking about our group as if we were isolated, as if the only threats we faced were random encounters with desperate individuals like Rick. But Mrs. Chen was describing a city where dozens of small communities were all trying to survive, in the same impossible conditions. Some of those communities would be potential allies, groups we could trade with or cooperate with for mutual benefit. Others would be competitors or threats, groups that might view our resources as something they needed to take for their own survival. I spent that afternoon making a map of what Mrs. Chen remembered about the other survivor groups she'd encountered. There was a group of families holed up in an elementary school about 8 blocks north of us, a community of college students who'd taken over a small apartment building near the university. An older man who claimed to be a retired military officer and was organizing people into what he called a survival unit in a strip mall on the other side of town. Most interesting was her description of a group that had established itself in a large grocery store about 2 miles south of us. They had access to a lot of food, but they were reportedly struggling with heating and security issues. That sounded like a potential trading opportunity. We had figured out how to stay warm and safe, but our food supplies were limited. They had food, but needed the kind of organizational and security expertise we'd developed. That evening, I proposed something to the group that I never would have imagined suggesting 2 weeks earlier. I wanted to send out a scouting party to make contact with some of these other survivor communities. Not to join them or to ask for help, but to start building relationships that might benefit everyone involved. Bob and Jim volunteered immediately, and Sarah said she'd like to go as well, pointing out that her medical skills might be valuable for trade negotiations. Miguel offered to stay behind and help protect the group while the scouts were away. But as we were planning this expedition, Mrs. Patterson raised a concern that made me realize I'd been thinking too optimistically about the possibilities for cooperation. What if they don't want to trade, she asked. What if they decide they'd rather just take what we have? It was a fair question, and it was one I didn't have a good answer for. Every group we approached would be making the same calculation about us that we were making about them. Are these people potential allies, or are they threats that need to be eliminated? I realized that sending out scouts wasn't just about gathering information or establishing trade relationships. It was about advertising our existence to groups that might decide we were worth attacking. But at the same time, staying isolated and trying to survive on our own didn't seem sustainable either. We needed allies, and we needed access to resources we couldn't produce ourselves. The 13th day was when we had our first real internal conflict since the rationing system had been established. Carmen Ramirez came to me with a complaint about the way we were distributing responsibilities within the group. It's not fair, she said. Some people are working harder than others, but everyone gets the same amount of food. Miguel and I are doing most of the cooking and cleaning, but Bob just sits around most of the time working on projects that don't really need to be done. I understood her frustration, but I also knew that this was exactly the kind of thinking that could destroy our group from the inside. Once people started making judgments about who deserved what based on their contributions, we'd end up with the same kind of hierarchy and conflict that existed in the world outside. Everyone contributes what they can, I told Carmen. Bob's projects might seem unnecessary to you, but they're the reason we stayed safe when Rick and his friends tried to break in. Mrs. Patterson might not be able to do physical labor, but her medical knowledge has already helped 3 people in this group avoid serious health problems. Carmen nodded, but I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced, and she wasn't wrong about the unequal distribution of work. Some people were naturally more inclined to stay busy and contribute actively to the group's survival, Others were more passive, waiting to be told what to do or finding reasons why they couldn't take on certain responsibilities. This conversation made me realize that managing our little community was going to require more than just rationing food and organizing security. I was going to have to become a mediator, a counselor, a judge of disputes and conflicts that had nothing to do with survival, but everything to do with human nature. That afternoon, I called another group meeting. This time, instead of talking about food or security, I wanted to talk about fairness and responsibility. I asked everyone to be honest about their contributions to the group and to identify areas where they thought they could do more to help. The conversation was uncomfortable, but it was also productive. Jim Henderson admitted that he'd been avoiding some of the cleaning duties because he didn't think they were important. Mrs. Chen offered to take over some of the food preparation tasks that didn't require standing for long periods. Even the children volunteered to help with simple jobs like organizing supplies and keeping track of inventory. But the most important outcome of that meeting was the establishment of what I started thinking of as our group charter, a set of principles and agreements about how we would make decisions, resolve conflicts, and distribute both responsibilities and resources. Everyone would contribute according to their abilities, and everyone would receive according to their needs. Decisions that affected the entire group would be made by consensus when possible, but in emergency situations, I would have the authority to make unilateral choices. Conflicts between individuals would be brought to the group for resolution, rather than being allowed to fester and create divisions. It wasn't a perfect system, and I knew it would be tested many times in the days and weeks ahead. But it was a start toward creating the kind of community that could survive not just the physical challenges of our situation, but the psychological and social challenges as well. That night, as I was doing my evening inventory count, I made a discovery that changed everything about our timeline and our planning. We weren't going to make it 3 weeks on our current supplies. We were barely going to make it 2 weeks. I'd been calculating our food consumption based on the portions we'd been serving, but I hadn't been accounting for the psychological factor of hunger. People who are scared and cold burn more calories than people who are comfortable and secure. The stress of our situation, the constant vigilance required for security, the extra effort needed for everything from staying warm to maintaining the building, all of it was increasing our nutritional needs beyond what I'd anticipated. I stared at those shelves and realized I was making the same mistake every failing restaurant makes. I wasn't planning for the long term. But this wasn't about profit margins anymore. This was about keeping 12 people alive, and I was starting to understand that my little diner might be the only thing standing between them and freezing to death in the streets of a city that had become a frozen wasteland where the only law was survival of the strongest. The 13th day was also when I realized we had a much bigger problem than just food rationing. That evening, after our group meeting about responsibilities and fairness, I was doing my usual inventory count when I discovered something that made my blood run cold. 2 cans of soup were missing from our carefully organized storage area in the basement. At first, I thought I'd made a counting error. I rechecked my numbers 3 times, went through every shelf systematically, even looked in places where the cans couldn't possibly be. But there was no mistake. Someone in our group was taking food without permission, and they were being careful about it, taking just enough that it wouldn't be noticed immediately. I sat in that basement storage area for almost an hour, trying to decide what to do. This wasn't like Carmen giving Sophia extra portions from her own food. This was someone stealing from the group's collective supplies, putting everyone's survival at risk for their own benefit. It was exactly the kind of behavior that could destroy our community from the inside. The next morning, I didn't say anything to the group about the missing food. Instead, I started watching people more carefully, paying attention to who went near the storage area and when. I also started marking the cans and packages in ways that would be invisible to a casual observer, but would tell me exactly which items had been moved. What I discovered over the next 2 days was worse than I'd feared. The food theft wasn't random or desperate. It was systematic and planned. Someone was taking a little bit every day, carefully selecting items that wouldn't be missed immediately, and they were good at covering their tracks. The 15th day brought a new challenge that I should have seen coming but somehow hadn't prepared for. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who'd arrived 3 days earlier, collapsed while helping with the morning meal preparation. Sarah immediately went into nurse mode, checking her pulse and breathing, trying to determine what was wrong. "She's dehydrated," Sarah told me quietly, "and malnourished. She's been giving away part of her food portions to the children." I looked at Mrs. Chen, this tiny 70-something woman who barely spoke English but had somehow survived 2 days. Walking through frozen streets to reach us, and I realized that our rationing system had a flaw I hadn't considered. Some people, especially the elderly and those who'd grown up in cultures where sacrificing for the younger generation was considered normal, would literally starve themselves to feed others. Mrs. Patterson came over to where Sarah was examining Mrs. Chen and confirmed what I was starting to suspect. "She's been doing the same thing I was thinking about doing," Mrs. Patterson said, "giving her food to the children because she thinks they need it more than she does." That afternoon, I had to make another adjustment to our group rules. From now on, everyone would eat their meals together in the main dining area. No one would be allowed to save food for later or give their portions to other people. It was the only way to ensure that everyone was actually getting the nutrition they needed to survive. But this rule change also meant that I had to confront the food theft issue directly. If everyone was eating together and no one was allowed to save food, then whoever was taking supplies from the basement wouldn't be able to hide it anymore. That evening, after everyone had finished dinner and most of the group was gathered around the gas stove for warmth, I announced that we had a problem. I explained about the missing food, about the careful tracking I'd been doing, and about the fact that someone in our group was putting everyone else's survival at risk. "I'm not going to accuse anyone specifically," I said, "but I need whoever is taking food to understand that this has to stop. We're all counting on each other and we can't afford to have someone breaking the rules that keep us all alive." The silence that followed my announcement was heavier than any sound I'd ever heard. Everyone was looking at each other, wondering who among them was the thief, wondering if they could trust the people they'd been depending on for their survival. Jim Henderson was the first to speak. "What happens if they don't stop?" he asked. "What happens if someone keeps stealing food?" It was a fair question, and it was one I'd been dreading. "Then we'll have to make some very difficult decisions about whether they can continue to be part of this group," I said. The 16th day was when I caught him. Mark Sullivan was a man in his 40s who'd joined our group on the 10th day, claiming that his apartment building had become uninhabitable due to heating problems. He'd seemed grateful for our help, had contributed to the work assignments I'd given him, and had never caused any problems or conflicts with other group members. But at 3 o'clock in the morning on the 16th day, I found him in the basement, storage area with a backpack full of canned goods. I'd been having trouble sleeping since the food theft started, so I'd taken to doing random checks on our supplies at different times of the day and night. When I saw the light from Mark's flashlight moving around in the basement, I knew I'd found our thief. Mark looked up when he heard me coming down the stairs, and for a moment, I saw pure panic in his eyes. Then his expression changed to something harder, more defiant. "I can explain," he said. "I'm listening," I told him. Mark set down his backpack and looked me in the eye. "I've got a sick brother," he said. "He's holed up in an apartment about 6 blocks from here and he can't travel. I've been taking food to him because he'll die if I don't." It was a good story and it might have even been true, but it didn't matter. "Why didn't you tell us about your brother when you first arrived?" I asked. "Why didn't you ask the group if we could help him?" Mark's defiance cracked a little. "Because I knew you'd say no. Because you already have too many people to feed, and you can't afford to take on someone else who can't contribute to the group." He was probably right about that, but it still didn't justify what he'd been doing. "That wasn't your decision to make," I told him. "This food belongs to everyone in the group, including the children. When you take it without permission, you're stealing from people who trust you." Mark nodded slowly, and I could see that he understood the situation he was in. "What happens now?" he asked. I thought about the conversation we'd had as a group the night before, about trust and responsibility, and the difficult decisions that might be necessary to keep everyone alive. I thought about Sophia Ramirez and Jake and Emma Henderson, children who were depending on the adults around them to make the right choices. "Now you have to choose," I told Mark. "Either your brother comes here and becomes part of our group, following the same rules as everyone else, or you leave with him and don't come back. Mark was quiet for a long time, clearly struggling with the decision. Finally, he asked, "What if he's too sick to travel? What if bringing him here would put him at risk? Then you make the same choice parents all over this city are making." I said, "You decide whether your first loyalty is to your family or to the people who've been keeping you alive." It was a harsh thing to say, but the world had become a harsh place. Resources were limited, and every choice about who to help and who to turn away was a choice between life and death for someone. The next morning, Mark was gone. He'd taken his backpack and his personal belongings, but he'd left behind the food he'd been planning to steal. I never found out if he went back to his brother or if his brother even existed. In a way, it didn't matter. What mattered was that the group had been tested, and we'd made the hard choice to protect ourselves. The 17th day brought news that changed everything about how I thought about our long-term survival. Sarah Martinez had been talking with Mrs. Chen about her journey to reach us, trying to get more detailed information about the other survivor groups she'd encountered. What she learned made me realize that we needed to start thinking beyond just day-to-day survival. Mrs. Chen's English was limited, but between her broken sentences and Sarah's patient questioning, we learned that the group at the elementary school had already made contact with the military unit that the retired officer was organizing. They were working together, sharing resources and coordinating security efforts. More importantly, they were planning for spring. They were talking about planting crops, about establishing more permanent settlements, about building the kind of infrastructure that could support larger populations over the long term. This information made me realize that while we'd been focused on surviving the next few weeks, other groups were already thinking months and years ahead. We were in danger of being left behind, of becoming isolated and eventually overwhelmed by better organized communities. That afternoon, I called a meeting to discuss our long-term strategy. I laid out what we'd learned about the other survivor groups and proposed that we needed to start making contact with them, not just for immediate trade opportunities, but to establish ourselves as a valuable partner in whatever new society was emerging from the collapse of the old one. Bob Jenkins raised an immediate concern. "What do we have that they want?" he asked. "We're running low on food. We don't have any special equipment or weapons, and we're just 12 people in a diner." It was a fair question, but I'd been thinking about it since my conversation with Sarah and Mrs. Chen. "We have something they don't," I said. "We have experience working together as a group. We've figured out how to make decisions, how to resolve conflicts, how to maintain morale and discipline under extreme stress. We've proven that we can defend ourselves when necessary, but we've also shown that we can take in new people and integrate them successfully." Linda Henderson nodded thoughtfully. "You're talking about management skills," she said. "Leadership and organization." "Exactly," I told her. "Every group out there is struggling with the same problems we've faced. How do you distribute resources fairly? How do you maintain security without becoming paranoid? How do you make decisions that everyone can live with? We've developed solutions to these problems, and that makes us valuable as partners or advisors." The 18th day was when we sent out our first diplomatic mission. Bob, Jim, and Sarah volunteered to make contact with the group at the elementary school, carrying a carefully crafted message about our interest in cooperation and mutual support. I spent most of that day worrying about whether I'd made the right decision. Sending 3 of our strongest and most capable people away from the diner left us vulnerable to attack, but it also represented our best chance of establishing the kind of alliances that could ensure our long-term survival. Miguel and I worked together to reorganize our security arrangements with a smaller group. We moved the remaining 9 people into a more defensible area of the building and prepared contingency plans for what to do if we were attacked while our scouts were away. But the day passed without incident, and that evening Bob, Jim, and Sarah returned with news that exceeded my most optimistic expectations. The group at the elementary school was not only interested in cooperation, they were eager for it. They'd been struggling with exactly the kind of organizational and leadership problems we'd learned to solve. "They want to meet with you personally," Sarah told me. Their leader, a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Warren, she's a former college administrator, who's been trying to manage about 30 people with limited success. "When we described how you've organized our group, how you've handled food distribution and security and conflict resolution. She said it sounded like exactly what they need. The 19th day was when I had to make one of the hardest decisions of the entire month. Dr. Warren and two of her people came to visit our diner, ostensibly to discuss cooperation between our groups, but it became clear very quickly that what she really wanted was for me to leave my people and come work with her larger group. "You're wasting your talents here," she told me bluntly. 12 people in a diner? I've got 30 people in a much more secure facility with better resources and more potential for long-term sustainability. With your organizational skills and my administrative experience, we could build something really significant. It was a tempting offer. The elementary school was indeed more secure than our diner, with multiple exit routes and better defensive positions. They had access to more food through connections with other groups, and their larger numbers meant they could take on more ambitious projects and defend themselves more effectively. But they also had problems we'd managed to avoid. Dr. Warren described conflicts between different factions within her group, competition for leadership roles, and ongoing disputes about resource allocation that sometimes turned violent. She needed someone with my experience to help her manage these problems. The problem was that taking her offer would mean abandoning the people who'd been depending on me for almost 3 weeks. Miguel and his family, Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Chen, the Henderson family with their young children. These weren't just random people I'd happened to encounter during a crisis. They were my community, my family, my responsibility. "I appreciate the offer," I told Dr. Warren, "but my place is here with my people." Dr. Warren looked around at our small group, at the cramped conditions and limited resources, and shook her head. "You're making a mistake," she said. "Loyalty is admirable, but it's not going to keep these people alive when winter really sets in. You need to think bigger than this." After she left, I second-guessed my decision for hours. Was I being selfish? Keeping my group small and manageable when I could be helping a larger number of people survive? Was I putting my own comfort zone ahead of the greater good? But then I looked at Sofia Ramirez, helping her mother prepare dinner with the kind of casual competence that comes from weeks of working together as a team. I watched Jake and Emma Henderson playing quietly in the corner, secure in the knowledge that the adults around them were taking care of everything. I saw Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Chen sitting together by the stove, sharing stories in a mixture of English and gestures that somehow conveyed more than words could. These people trusted me. They'd followed my leadership through some of the most difficult circumstances any of us had ever faced, and they'd become more than just a survival group. They'd become a family. Abandoning them for the promise of better resources and easier problems would be a betrayal of everything we'd built together. The 20th day brought a new challenge that tested our community in a different way. Linda Henderson came to me with concerns about her children's emotional state. Jake and Emma had been handling the stress and uncertainty remarkably well for 10-year-olds, but the constant tension and the recent conflicts with outsiders were starting to take their toll. "They're having nightmares," Linda told me. "They're afraid to go to sleep because they think bad people are going to break in again. Emma asked me yesterday if we're all going to die, and I didn't know what to tell her." This was a problem I hadn't anticipated when I started thinking about survival and community management. I'd focused on physical needs like food and warmth and security, but I hadn't given enough consideration to the psychological and emotional needs of the people in our group, especially the children. Mrs. Patterson, drawing on her experience as a nurse and grandmother, suggested that we needed to create more normal routines for the children. "They need structure," she said. "They need to feel like there are still rules and expectations and patterns they can count on." Linda agreed and proposed that we establish regular school time for all 3 children in our group, not just busy work to keep them occupied, but real learning activities that would help them feel like they were still growing and developing, despite the chaos around them. It was a good idea, but it also represented another demand on our limited resources and energy. Someone would need to take responsibility for planning and supervising educational activities. We'd need materials and space and time that were already stretched thin. But as I watched Jake and Emma that evening, saw how they perked up when Linda started talking about math lessons and reading time, I realized that this wasn't just about keeping the children happy. It was about maintaining hope for the future. If we stopped believing that these children had a future worth preparing for, then we'd already lost the most important battle of all. The 21st day was when everything I'd been planning and preparing for over the past 3 weeks was put to the ultimate test. Miguel came running up from the basement storage area with news that made my heart stop. "Chef," he said, breathing hard from his sprint up the stairs. "They're coming. Rick and his people. I saw them through the basement window, and this time, they've got a lot more than 6 people." I looked out the front window and saw what Miguel meant. Rick had returned with at least a dozen people, maybe more. They were spread out around the building, moving carefully but purposefully, clearly planning a coordinated attack on multiple entry points. This wasn't going to be like the confrontation we'd had a week earlier. This was a full-scale assault by people who were desperate enough to risk everything for what we had. I called for our emergency security plan, but as people started moving to their assigned positions, I realized we had a serious problem. Our defensive strategy had been designed for our full group of 12 people, with Bob, Jim, and Sarah away. On the diplomatic mission to Dr. Warren's group, we only had 9 people to defend the building, and 3 of them were children. Miguel positioned himself at the back entrance to the kitchen, the same door Rick had broken through before. Mrs. Patterson and Linda Henderson took the children to our most secure hiding place behind the main counter. Mark Sullivan might have been gone, but his absence actually made our remaining group more cohesive and trustworthy. I took my grandfather's knife from my backpack and checked the other weapons we'd collected over the past weeks. The baseball bat, the small hatchet, a couple of heavy kitchen knives, the cast iron skillet that Sarah had used so effectively before. Not much against a dozen desperate people, but it would have to be enough. The attack came from 3 directions, simultaneously. Rick and 2 others hit the back door while another group tried to break through the boarded-up front windows. A third team was working on a side entrance I hadn't even known existed until I heard them prying at the door. What followed was the longest 10 minutes of my life. The sound of splintering wood and breaking glass, shouting and cursing from outside as Rick's people tried to force their way in, the crash of furniture being overturned and the clatter of makeshift weapons being dropped and retrieved. Miguel was holding the back entrance, using a combination of kitchen knives and pure determination to keep 3 people from getting through the door. Mrs. Chen, despite being in her 70s, had positioned herself at the side entrance with a heavy rolling pin and was making it very difficult for the attackers to get past her. I was moving between positions, trying to coordinate our defense while using my knife to drive back anyone who managed to get through our perimeter. It was chaos, but it was controlled chaos. We knew the building better than they did. We'd prepared for this scenario, and we were fighting for our home and our family. The turning point came when Linda Henderson made a decision that probably saved all our lives. Instead of staying hidden with the children like we'd planned, she grabbed the heaviest pot from our kitchen and started banging it against the metal exhaust hood above the stove. The noise was incredible, a ringing metallic crash that echoed through the building and out into the street. But more importantly, it was a signal. Linda was calling for help, hoping that other survivor groups in the area would hear the commotion and come to investigate. Whether by coincidence or because they actually heard Linda's signal, Bob, Jim, and Sarah chose that moment to return from their mission to Dr. Warren's group. They arrived to find Rick's people trying to break into the building and immediately understood what was happening. The 3 of them hit Rick's group from behind, catching them completely by surprise. Bob had his baseball bat, Jim had found a length of metal pipe somewhere, and Sarah was carrying a medical bag that turned out to contain some very effective improvised weapons. Within minutes, the entire dynamic of the fight changed. Rick's people, who'd been confident they could overwhelm our small group, suddenly found themselves caught between defenders inside the building and reinforcements outside. Several of them broke and ran immediately. Others tried to continue the fight but were quickly overwhelmed. Rick himself made it through the back door and into the kitchen, where he found himself face to face with me and my grandfather's knife. This time, there was no hesitation, no negotiation, no attempt to find a peaceful solution. Rick came at me with a crowbar, swinging it like a club at my head. I ducked under his swing and brought my knife up, not to cause serious injury, but to make it clear that I was prepared to do whatever was necessary to protect my people. The blade caught Rick across the chest, not deep enough to be life-threatening, but deep enough to make him understand that he'd underestimated what he was up against. He staggered backward, looking at the blood on his shirt, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw fear in his eyes. "This ends now," I told him. "You take your people and you leave and you don't come back. If I see you near this building again, if I hear that you've threatened anyone in this group, I won't be as generous next time." Rick looked around at his remaining people, most of whom were injured or retreating, and made the smart choice. He backed toward the door, keeping his eyes on me and my knife. "You think you've won," he said. "But winter's just getting started. You can't protect them forever." "I can protect them long enough," I told him. After they left, we spent the rest of the day securing the building and treating injuries. Nobody in our group had been seriously hurt, but everyone was shaken by the intensity and violence of the attack. That evening, as we were cleaning up the damage and reinforcing the broken doors and windows, Mrs. Patterson asked me a question that I'd been thinking about all day. "Do you think they'll come back again?" she said. I looked around at our little community, at the people who'd just proven they were willing to fight and risk their lives for each other, and I realized something important. We weren't just survivors anymore. We weren't just a random group of people who happened to be sharing resources during a crisis. We were a family. We were a community that had been tested by violence and conflict and had emerged stronger and more unified than before. Rick and his people could come back and probably would, but it wouldn't matter. We'd proven to ourselves and to anyone watching that we were willing and able to defend what we'd built together. But even as I was feeling proud of what we'd accomplished, I was also thinking about Rick's parting words. Winter was just getting started. The volcanic ash was still blocking out the sun. The temperatures were still dropping, and our food supplies were still running dangerously low. We'd won this battle, but the war for survival was far from over. And I was beginning to understand that the biggest challenges we faced might not come from outside attackers like Rick, but from the simple, inexorable reality of trying to keep 12 people alive in a world that had become fundamentally hostile to human life. The 22nd day was when I realized that winning the fight with Rick had created a new problem I hadn't anticipated. Word was spreading through the survivor communities about what had happened at our diner. Some groups saw us as potential allies who'd proven we could defend ourselves. Others saw us as a threat that needed to be eliminated before we became too powerful. Dr. Warren sent a messenger that morning with news that changed everything about our situation. 3 different groups had approached her asking about us, wanting to know our numbers, our resources, our defensive capabilities. 2 of them were interested in forming alliances. The third was asking questions that suggested they were planning an attack. "You've made yourselves a target," the messenger told me. "Dr. Warren wants you to know that her offer still stands. You and your people would be safer as part of her community." I thanked the messenger but sent him back with the same answer I'd given Dr. Warren before. We were staying together as a group in our own location, making our own decisions about our future. But after he left, I started thinking seriously about whether I was putting my pride ahead of my people's safety. The diner had served us well for 3 weeks, but it was never designed to be a fortress. If a large, well-organized group decided they wanted what we had, our defensive preparations might not be enough to stop them. That afternoon, I gathered everyone together to discuss our options. I laid out what the messenger had told me about other groups taking an interest in us, and I asked for honest opinions about whether we should consider relocating to a more secure facility. Miguel was the first to speak. "Chef, this place has been good to us. We know every corner, every hiding spot, every way in and out. If we move somewhere else, we lose that advantage." Bob nodded in agreement. "Plus, we've put a lot of work into making this place defendable. Starting over somewhere else means starting from scratch on security preparations." But Sarah raised a concern that made everyone think more carefully about the decision. "What if they're right about us being a target?" she said. "What if staying here means we're going to face attack after attack until we're overwhelmed?" It was Mrs. Patterson who provided the perspective that helped me make the decision. "In nursing," she said, "we had a saying about patients who were in critical condition. Sometimes the safest choice is the one that feels most dangerous. Sometimes you have to take risks to avoid bigger risks. I realized she was talking about more than just our physical location. She was talking about our identity as a group, our sense of ourselves as people who could make their own choices and control their own destiny. Moving to Dr. Warren's community might be safer in the short term, but it would also mean giving up the independence and self-determination that had made us strong. The 23rd day brought the heaviest blizzard we'd seen since the volcanic winter began. Snow was falling so thick that you couldn't see more than a few feet outside the windows, and the wind was howling with the intensity that made the whole building shake. But the blizzard also brought an unexpected opportunity. Around noon, we heard someone pounding on our front door, shouting for help in a voice that was barely audible over the wind. I looked through the reinforced peephole we'd installed after Rick's first visit and saw a young man, maybe 19 or 20 years old, covered in snow and obviously suffering from hypothermia. He was alone, carrying a backpack, and he looked like he was about to collapse. The smart thing would have been to turn him away. We were already stretched thin on resources, and taking in another person would mean adjusting our rationing calculations again. But looking at this kid standing in the blizzard, I thought about Mrs. Chen and how she'd looked when she'd arrived at our door barely conscious from cold and exhaustion. I opened the door and pulled him inside. His name was Jake Morrison, and he'd been walking for 3 days trying to reach the elementary school where Dr. Warren's group was based. He'd gotten lost in the storm and had been wandering through the snow for hours when he saw the light from our gas stove through our windows. Jake's story was both heartbreaking and informative. He'd been part of a group of college students who'd been surviving in a dormitory building near the university, but their situation had deteriorated over the past week as their food supplies ran out and their heating system failed. Most of them gave up, Jake told us as Sarah checked him for signs of frostbite. They just stopped trying, stopped getting up in the morning, stopped looking for food, stopped taking care of themselves. By the time I left, half of them were too weak to even get out of bed. What Jake was describing was something I'd been worried about but hadn't seen in our own group. The psychological breakdown that happens when people lose hope, when the stress and hardship become too much to bear, and they simply stop fighting to survive. "What made you different?" I asked him. "What made you keep trying when the others gave up?" Jake thought about that for a moment. "I guess I kept believing that there had to be people out there who were making it work. People who'd figured out how to stay alive and stay human at the same time." That evening, as the blizzard continued to rage outside, Jake told us more about what he'd seen during his 3-day journey through the city. Most of it was bad news. Buildings collapsed under the weight of snow and ash, whole neighborhoods that had been abandoned when the power grid failed. Bodies frozen in the streets of people who'd died trying to find food or shelter. But he'd also seen signs of hope. Smoke rising from chimneys and improvised heating systems. Lights in windows where people had found ways to generate electricity. Messages scratched into walls and doorways. Communications between survivor groups about resources and safe routes through the city. "People are adapting," Jake said. "It's not the same world it was a month ago, but it's not the end of the world either. It's just different." The 24th day was when I had to make the hardest decision since this whole crisis began. Our food supplies had reached a critical point. Even with the most careful rationing, we had maybe 4 days of meals left for 13 people. Something had to be done, and it had to be done immediately. I'd been putting off this decision for weeks, hoping that conditions would improve or that help would arrive or that some other solution would present itself. But standing in that basement storage area, looking at shelves that were almost completely empty, I realized that hope and wishful thinking weren't going to keep anyone alive. I called Miguel down to the basement and showed him the inventory. "We need to go out and find more supplies," I told him. "Not just a quick trip to a nearby store, but a real expedition to that grocery warehouse Mrs. Chen told us about." Miguel looked at the empty shelves and nodded grimly. "How many people?" he asked. "5, I said. "You, me, Bob, Jim, and Sarah. We take the strongest and most capable people, and we leave the others here to defend the diner." "That's risky, Chef. If something happens to us out there, the people who stay behind won't be able to protect themselves, if they're attacked. He was right, but I'd already thought through all the alternatives. If we don't get more food, it won't matter whether they can defend themselves or not. Everyone's going to starve. The warehouse expedition would be the most dangerous thing any of us had attempted since the volcanic winter began. The building was 2 miles away through snow that was now over 4 feet deep in most places. The temperature was so low that exposed skin would freeze within minutes, and we had no way of knowing whether the warehouse was already occupied by another survivor group or whether it had been cleaned out completely. But it was our only option. The smaller stores and restaurants in our immediate area had all been emptied weeks ago. The warehouse represented our best chance of finding the kind of bulk supplies that could keep 13 people alive for more than a few days. That evening, I explained the plan to the rest of the group. Jim Henderson would stay behind to help coordinate the defense of the diner, but Bob would come with the expedition team. Linda would be in charge of the group while we were gone, working with Mrs. Patterson to make decisions about rationing and security. The hardest part was explaining to the children why 5 of the adults were leaving and might not come back. Jake and Emma Henderson were old enough to understand the basic situation, but Sophia Ramirez was only 8 and kept asking when we'd be back and whether we were abandoning them. "We're coming back," I told her, hoping it was true, "but we need to find more food so everyone can keep eating." The 25th day was when we set out for the warehouse. We left before dawn, carrying backpacks with basic supplies and makeshift weapons. The plan was to travel light on the way there and load up with as much food as we could carry for the return trip. The journey through the frozen city was like walking through an alien landscape. Denver had been completely transformed by the volcanic winter. Familiar streets were buried under snow and ash. Buildings were dark and empty, their windows broken or boarded up. Cars were buried so deep that only their antennas and mirrors were visible above the snow. But the most disturbing thing was the silence. In a normal winter, even in heavy snow, you'd hear sounds of life. Snow plows, car engines, people talking as they walked. Now there was nothing but the wind and the crunch of our footsteps through the snow. It took us almost 4 hours to travel those 2 miles. We had to stop frequently to rest and warm up, taking shelter in abandoned buildings and using body heat to prevent frostbite. Sarah, with her medical training, kept checking everyone for signs of hypothermia and exposure. When we finally reached the warehouse, we found both good news and bad news. The good news was that the building was structurally sound and hadn't been completely cleaned out. There were still pallets of canned goods, bags of rice and flour, cases of bottled water. The bad news was that we weren't the first people to discover this resource. Someone else had been using the warehouse as a supply depot, and they'd organized the remaining food into neat stacks and sections. This wasn't random scavenging. This was a systematic operation run by people who planned to keep coming back. "What do we do?" Bob asked quietly as we surveyed the organized stockpiles. I thought about the ethics of the situation. Taking food that another group had clearly claimed and organized could be considered theft. But our own group was facing starvation, and there was no way to know whether the people who'd organized this warehouse were friendly or hostile. "We take what we need," I said finally. "But we leave clear signs that we were here and that we're interested in trading or negotiating rather than just stealing." We spent the next 2 hours carefully selecting supplies and loading our backpacks. We focused on high-calorie, long-lasting foods that would give us the best nutrition-to-weight ratio for the difficult journey back to the diner. But as we were preparing to leave, we heard voices outside the warehouse. People were approaching and they didn't sound happy. Miguel motioned for everyone to take cover behind the stacked pallets while he moved to a window to see who was coming. What he saw made him signal for complete silence. 6 people in winter gear, all carrying weapons, were examining the area around the warehouse entrance. They were clearly the group that had been using this building as their supply depot, and they were obviously upset to discover that someone had been inside. We were trapped. The warehouse only had 2 exits, and both were being watched by people who probably wouldn't be interested in negotiating if they found us inside their supply depot with backpacks full of their food. For the next 3 hours, we hid in that warehouse while the other group searched the building and the surrounding area. It was some of the most intense time I had experienced since this whole crisis began. We couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even shift position without risking detection. But we also couldn't stay hidden forever. Our own group back at the diner was expecting us to return, and every hour we delayed was an hour closer to everyone, running out of food completely. The breakthrough came when Sarah, using her medical knowledge and her experience working in emergency situations, came up with a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane. She would create a diversion by triggering the building's fire alarm system. The noise would draw the searchers to one part of the warehouse, while we escaped through the opposite exit. It was risky because it would definitely alert them to our presence, but it might also give us the few minutes we needed to get away. When Sarah triggered the alarm, the sound was so loud and unexpected that even we were startled despite knowing it was coming. The searchers immediately rushed toward the source of the noise, shouting to each other about what was happening. We used those precious seconds to slip out the back exit and start running through the snow toward home. It was the most difficult 2 miles I'd ever traveled. We were carrying heavy packs. The snow was even deeper than it had been that morning, and we knew that the people from the warehouse might be following us. But we made it back to the diner just as the sun was setting on the 25th day. We'd found enough food to keep everyone alive for at least another 2 weeks, maybe 3, if we were careful about rationing. More importantly, we'd proven to ourselves that we could take the kind of risks necessary for long-term survival. We could venture out into the dangerous world beyond our little sanctuary, find the resources we needed, and make it back home safely. But I also knew that our raid on the warehouse had consequences that we'd have to deal with eventually. The people who'd been using that building knew that someone else was operating in their territory. They'd be looking for us, and when they found us, we'd have to decide whether to fight, negotiate, or run. As I looked around at the faces of the people who'd been waiting for us to return, I realized that we'd crossed another line in our transformation, from ordinary citizens to survivors. We weren't just defending ourselves anymore. We were actively competing with other groups for the resources necessary to stay alive. The world had become a place where taking what you needed from others was sometimes the only alternative to watching your own people die. I didn't like that reality, but I was learning to accept it as the price of keeping the people I cared about alive in a world that had become fundamentally hostile to human life. The 26th day was when the consequences of our warehouse raid came back to find us. I was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when Miguel called out from his position at the front window. "Chef, we've got company, and they don't look friendly." I looked outside and saw 5 people approaching our building, moving in a coordinated formation that suggested military or police training. They were well equipped with winter gear and weapons, and they were clearly scanning our defenses as they approached. The leader was a woman in her 40s with short gray hair, and the kind of posture that comes from years of giving orders and having them followed. When she was close enough to be heard, she called out in a voice that carried authority and no small amount of threat. "We know you were in our warehouse yesterday," she said. "We want to talk." I went to the front door but didn't open it. "What do you want to talk about?" I called, back. "Compensation," she said. "You took our supplies. We want them back, or we want something of equal value in return." It was a reasonable demand, and it was being made by someone who seemed capable of negotiation rather than just violence. But I also knew that opening negotiations with this group would set a precedent for how we dealt with other communities in the future. "We're willing to talk," I told her. "But not with your people armed and positioned around our building like you're planning an assault." The woman considered this for a moment, then signaled to her team. They moved back several yards and lowered their weapons, though they didn't put them away entirely. "My name is Captain Susan Rodriguez," she said. "Retired Army, currently in charge of security for the South Denver Survival Collective. We've been using that warehouse as our primary supply depot for 2 weeks. I opened the door but stayed in the doorway where I could retreat quickly if necessary. Dante Romano. I run this community. We were facing starvation, and we took what we needed to keep 13 people alive." Captain Rodriguez nodded. "I understand the situation. We're all making hard choices these days, but taking supplies without permission destabilizes the entire system we're trying to build for long-term survival." She had a point. If every group felt free to raid other groups' supply depots whenever they faced shortages, it would be impossible for anyone to plan or build for the future. But I also wasn't going to apologize for keeping my people alive. "What kind of compensation are you looking for?" I asked. "Information," Rodriguez said. "We've heard about your group from other communities. Dr. Warren at the elementary school, the families at the community center on 15th Street. They all say you figured out something the rest of us are struggling with, which is how to make group decisions without splitting apart, how to handle conflicts without violence, how to maintain morale and discipline when everything's falling apart around you." I realized that Captain Rodriguez was offering me the same thing Dr. Warren had offered, but in a different form. Instead of asking me to abandon my people and join her larger community, she was proposing some kind of consulting or advisory arrangement. "You want management advice in exchange for the supplies we took from your warehouse?" "More than that," Rodriguez said. "We want a formal alliance. The South Denver Survival Collective has about 60 people now, spread across 4 different locations. We've got resources and security capabilities that your group needs. You've got organizational expertise that we need." It was a tempting offer, but it was also dangerous. Allying ourselves with a 60-person organization would give us access to more resources and better security, but it would also make us a target for any groups that saw the collective as a threat. I told Captain Rodriguez that I'd need to discuss her proposal with my people, and she agreed to return the next day for our answer. After she left, I called a group meeting to discuss what was being offered and what it might mean for our future. The discussion revealed a fundamental split in our group that I hadn't fully recognized before. Some people, led by Bob and Jim, were enthusiastic about the alliance. They saw it as our best chance for long-term survival and growth. Others, including Miguel and Mrs. Patterson, were more cautious. They worried that joining a larger organization would mean losing the close-knit family feeling that had made our group special. "We've been through a lot together," Miguel said. "We've figured out how to trust each other and work together. If we become part of something bigger, we might lose that." Sarah raised a different concern. "What happens if their priorities and our priorities conflict? What if they ask us to do something we're not comfortable with?" The debate continued for hours, and I found myself torn between the practical advantages of the alliance and the emotional attachment I felt to our independence. We'd built something special in this diner over the past 26 days. We'd become a family, a community that worked because everyone knew and trusted everyone else. But I also knew that winter was getting worse, not better. The temperatures were still dropping. The ash was still blocking out the sun, and our food supplies were still uncertain. Maybe it was time to think bigger than just our small group of 13 people. The 27th day was when we discovered that the decision about Captain Rodriguez's alliance might not be entirely ours to make. Jake Morrison, the young man who'd joined us during the blizzard, came to me with information that changed everything about our situation. "I've been talking to the other survivor groups," Jake said. "Not officially, just casual conversations when people are out scavenging or looking for supplies. There's something you need to know about the South Denver Survival Collective." What Jake had learned was both impressive and concerning. The collective wasn't just a loose alliance of survivor communities. It was a highly organized operation with clear hierarchy, strict rules, and ambitious plans for expansion. "They're not just trying to survive," Jake told me. "They're trying to rebuild. They've got plans for establishing permanent settlements, setting up agricultural operations, even restoring some basic infrastructure." That sounded positive, but Jake's expression suggested there was more to the story. "The thing is," he continued, "they're not asking groups to join them. They're telling them. Communities that don't want to be part of the collective are being pressured to relocate or merge with other groups that are willing to cooperate." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. "Are you saying they're forcing people to join?" "Not exactly," Jake said. "But they're making it clear that independent communities aren't going to be tolerated long-term. They see them as inefficient and destabilizing." This information put Captain Rodriguez's offer in a completely different light. It wasn't really an offer at all. It was an ultimatum disguised as a negotiation. join the collective voluntarily, or eventually be forced to join under less favorable terms. That evening, I found myself facing the hardest decision I'd made since the volcanic winter began. Keep our group independent and risk being eventually absorbed by the collective anyway, or join voluntarily while we still had some bargaining power. Mrs. Patterson came to sit with me by the gas stove after everyone else had gone to sleep. "You're thinking about accepting their offer," she said. "I'm thinking about keeping everyone alive," I told her. "And I'm not sure we can do that on our own much longer." "You know what my grandfather used to say about surviving hard times?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "He said the most dangerous moment is when someone offers you safety in exchange for your freedom, because once you give up your freedom, you can't get it back." I thought about her grandfather's wisdom, and about my own grandfather's stories of surviving in a small Italian village, where cooperation meant life and competition meant death. But those were different times, different circumstances. The world my grandfather had known still had functioning governments and social institutions. The world we were living in now had none of that. The 28th day was when Captain Rodriguez returned for our answer, and I gave her one that surprised even myself. "We'll join the collective," I told her, "but with conditions." Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "You're not really in a position to make demands." "Yes, we are," I said. "You need what we have as much as we need what you have, so here are our terms." I laid out a proposal that I'd been working on since Jake had told me about the collective's expansion plans. Our group would maintain its independence and internal decision-making authority. We'd cooperate with collective operations and contribute to shared resources, but we wouldn't be absorbed into their larger organizational structure. "Think of it as a franchise arrangement," I told Rodriguez. "We operate under the collective umbrella, but we maintain our own identity and management." Rodriguez was quiet for a long time, clearly considering the implications of what I was proposing. Finally, she nodded slowly. "It's not the arrangement we usually make," she said, "but you're right that you have something we need. Your group has the best track record for internal stability of any community we've encountered." The alliance was formalized that afternoon with a handshake and an agreement that we'd start coordinating our operations with the collective while maintaining our base at the diner. It wasn't perfect, but it was a compromise that gave us access to resources and security while preserving the independence that had made us strong. The 29th day brought our first test of the new alliance arrangement. The collective needed volunteers for a major supply expedition to a distribution center on the outskirts of the city. The operation would require 40 people and would take 3 days to complete. Captain Rodriguez asked for 4 volunteers from our group, including me as a leadership consultant for the expedition. It was exactly the kind of cooperation the Mayor Alliance was supposed to facilitate, but it also meant leaving our diner with only 9 people for 3 days. I chose Bob, Jim, and Sarah to accompany me, the same core team that had proven effective on our warehouse raid. Miguel would stay behind to coordinate the defense of the diner, working with Linda Henderson to maintain our security and rationing. Systems. The supply expedition was both a success and an education in how the collective operated. They were highly organized and efficient, with clear chains of command and well-developed procedures for everything from route planning to conflict resolution. But I also saw things that made me glad we'd negotiated to maintain our independence. The collective's approach to resource distribution was more hierarchical than ours, with leadership getting better rations and accommodations than ordinary members. Their security operations were more militaristic, with strict discipline and harsh punishments for rule violations. Most concerning was their attitude toward other survivor groups. The collective saw itself as the legitimate authority for the entire region, and they viewed independent communities not as potential allies, but as problems to be solved. "You're lucky you joined when you did," one of the collective members told me during the expedition. "Rodriguez has been talking about bringing your group into compliance for weeks. If you'd said no to the alliance, you would have been classified as a resistant community." "What happens to resistant communities?" I asked. "They get relocated to areas where they can't interfere with collective operations," he said. "Or they get absorbed into existing collective settlements as individual members rather than intact groups." The 30th day was our last day as truly independent survivors. Tomorrow we'd begin operating as part of the South Denver Survival Collective, with all the benefits and obligations that entailed. I spent that evening walking through the diner, looking at the place that had been our home and sanctuary for a month. The kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals for my makeshift family. The dining area where we'd held our meetings and made our decisions. The basement where we'd stored our supplies and hidden during attacks. This building had seen us transform from a random group of desperate people into a functioning community. We'd learned how to work together, how to make hard decisions, how to defend ourselves when necessary. We'd taken in strangers and made them family. We'd faced starvation and violence and despair, and we'd survived all of it. But I also knew that our story wasn't ending. It was just beginning a new chapter. The collective offered opportunities we could never have achieved on our own. Access to medical supplies and equipment, coordination with other communities for trade and mutual support, the possibility of building something permanent and sustainable for the future. As I was finishing my evening inventory count, Sofia Ramirez came over to me with a question that reminded me why all of this mattered. "Chef Dante," she said, "are we still going to be a family when we join the big group?" I knelt down so I could look her in the eye and gave her the most honest answer I could. "Yes, Sophia, we're always going to be a family. That's not something that changes just because we're working with other people." "Good," she said, "because I like our family." That night, I sat by the gas stove that had kept us warm for 30 days and thought about everything we'd accomplished and everything that lay ahead. We'd proven that ordinary people could organize themselves, make difficult decisions, and survive in circumstances that would have seemed impossible just a month before. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. We'd have to learn how to maintain our identity as a group while being part of something larger. We'd have to navigate the politics and personalities of a 60-person organization while staying true to the principles that had made us strong. But if the past 30 days had taught me anything, it was that people are capable of adapting to circumstances they never could have imagined. We'd gone from being strangers thrown together by crisis to being a family that would do anything to protect each other. 30 days ago, I thought survival was about having enough food and staying warm. I was wrong. Survival is about the people you choose to protect and the person you choose to become when everything else falls apart. We'd proven we could protect each other, and we'd become the kind of people who could build something lasting, even in the ruins of the old world. The lodge we'd talked about was still days away through frozen wilderness. We were carrying more than just supplies now. We were carrying hope, experience, and the knowledge that we could face whatever came next as long as we faced it together. The sun might still be hidden behind volcanic ash and winter might still be just beginning. But we'd learned something that no amount of cold or darkness could take away. We'd learned that even when the world ends, the right people working together can build something new from the ashes. If we could make it through the next 30 days, if we could build something lasting with the collective while keeping our family intact, then maybe this story wasn't about the end of the world after all. Maybe it was about the beginning of something better.